Chapter 1. The Age of Absolute Faith. There was a time when belief was not questioned, not examined, and not earned. It was simply inherited, like a surname or the color of one's skin. Before a child learned how to walk, before they understood fear or loss, they were taught to fold their hands, bow their head, or whisper words they did not yet understand. Faith came before language. God came before thought. In those days, the world felt protected. Not because it was safe, but because people believed it was being watched. Every culture had its own name, its own symbols, its own rituals. But the core belief was the same. Someone greater was in control. Someone unseen was keeping count of tears, listening to prayers, and waiting for the right moment to intervene. The sky was not just space, it was a ceiling, behind which divine eyes observed humanity with care. Parents spoke of God the way one speaks of a powerful guardian. "Do not worry," they said, "God will take care of it." And children believed them. Why wouldn't they? Adults sounded certain. Their voices did not tremble when they spoke of divine protection. They prayed before meals, before journeys, before sleep, and every morning they woke up alive. To a child, that was proof enough. Faith was never introduced as a question. It was presented as a fact. Temples, churches, mosques, and shrines stood at the centers of cities, silent promises built from stone. People gathered there not just to worship, but to reassure themselves. The rituals were repetitive, almost rhythmic, like lullabies sung to an anxious human mind. Candles were lit, bells were rung, chants were repeated, not because people doubted, but because repetition felt like reinforcement. The more one prayed, the safer the world seemed. And for a long time, it worked. When hardship came, and it always did, people endured it with patience, because suffering had meaning. Pain was not random. It was part of a divine plan too complex for humans to understand. Loss was not loss. It was a test. Death was not an end. It was transition. Every unanswered prayer was softened by the same comforting phrase: God knows best. That belief did something powerful. It softened fear. It turned uncertainty into acceptance. People did not demand answers because faith had already answered for them. To question God felt like questioning gravity, unnecessary and even dangerous. Even disasters were absorbed into belief. When floods destroyed homes or earthquakes swallowed cities, people called it destiny. When disease spread, they called it punishment or purification. The explanations changed. The conclusion never did. God was still in control. And so, humans did what they had always done best. They trusted. Not because they had evidence, but because belief was easier than doubt. Doubt demanded responsibility. Belief required surrender. Religious leaders spoke with confidence. Their words wrapped uncertainty in certainty, and people clung to them like lifelines. Have faith, they said. Pray harder. And the people did. Not because they were weak, but because faith offered something no tool or science could offer at that time. Hope without conditions. Inside homes, small rituals shaped daily life. A prayer before leaving the house, a blessing before a child's exam, a whispered plea before a medical diagnosis. God was invited into every moment, not as a guest, but as a permanent resident of the human mind. Belief shaped morality as well. People feared doing wrong not only because of laws, but because God was watching. Heaven and hell were not abstract ideas. They were systems of justice when human systems failed. When criminals went unpunished, people said, God will judge them. When good people suffered, they said, God will reward them. Faith filled the gaps reality could not. And in that age, belief was not a weakness, it was survival. It was the thread that held societies together when knowledge was limited and the world felt vast and hostile. God was not just a deity. God was reassurance. But beneath this absolute faith, something fragile existed, something no one wanted to see. Belief had slowly begun to replace responsibility. Trust in divine protection dulled the instinct to act. People waited for miracles instead of preparing for consequences. They prayed for rain instead of storing water. They asked for healing instead of understanding disease. Action was postponed because faith promised intervention. Still, no one called it dangerous. It felt natural. It felt right. After all, belief had existed longer than memory itself. It had survived generations, empires, and wars. It had outlived kings and outlasted civilizations. Who was anyone to question something so ancient? And so, humanity lived wrapped in faith, like a child wrapped in a blanket. Warm, protected, and unaware of the cold reality beyond it. They believed God was watching. They believed God would intervene. They believed God would save them. And for a long time, that belief was enough. Because in the age of absolute faith, belief was not a choice. It was tradition. It was comfort. It was everything humanity had. Chapter 2. When prayers became louder. Faith does not disappear quietly. It grows louder first. When the world began to tremble, not metaphorically, but physically, people did what they had always done in moments of fear. They prayed. Only this time, they prayed more, louder, longer, together. Disasters no longer arrived one at a time. They came layered, relentless, overlapping. A disease spread faster than understanding. Fire swallowed forests that had stood for centuries. Rivers rose without warning and drowned entire towns overnight. War returned to places that believed themselves too civilized for it. And everywhere, prayers multiplied. Churches extended their hours. Temples overflowed beyond their gates. Prayer mats lined streets. Digital prayer groups formed across continents, connecting millions of voices in synchronized hope. Humanity had never prayed this much before, not because it had become more faithful, but because it had become more afraid. People believed intensity could compensate for urgency. Children were taught new prayers before bedtime. Elderly hands shook as they clutched beads and scriptures. Entire families knelt together, bargaining silently with the divine. "Take anything," they whispered. "Just don't take this." Faith, once calm and steady, became desperate. Religious leaders called for unity. "This is the time to return to God," they said. And people listened. Old doubts were buried under fresh fear. Science offered explanations, but belief offered comfort. Numbers and data could describe what was happening, but only faith promised that it would stop. Hospitals filled. Sirens became background noise. Faces disappeared behind masks and fear. Yet even as human systems strained under pressure, belief stood tall. People said this was the final test before salvation, that suffering meant deliverance was near. Prayers became louder because silence felt unbearable.
In homes, people prayed for the same things night after night, for breath, for safety, for normalcy. Social media transformed into digital altars, flooded with verses, invocations, and pleas. Every tragedy was followed by the same words, "Pray for them." And people did. But slowly, something unsettling crept in. Not loudly, not suddenly, but like a cold draft through a familiar room. The prayers were increasing, the suffering was not decreasing. At first, no one said it out loud. They blamed themselves. Maybe the prayers weren't sincere enough. Maybe faith had weakened. Maybe humanity had sinned too much. People searched inward, not upward, convinced the failure was theirs. So they prayed harder. But fear has a way of sharpening awareness. People began noticing patterns they had once ignored. The faithful suffered as much as the faithless. Innocent children died alongside the cruel. Entire communities prayed together and buried together. The belief remained, but it began to strain under the weight of reality. Still, no one stopped praying, because stopping would mean admitting something unthinkable, that maybe prayer was not protection. And humanity was not ready for that thought yet.
Chapter 3. The silence that hurt. God did not respond with thunder. God did not respond with miracles. God did not respond at all. At first, people said silence was part of the plan. God works in mysterious ways, they repeated, like a spell meant to shield them from despair. Silence was reframed as wisdom, delay as purpose. But silence, stretched over time, becomes something else. Hospitals turned into waiting rooms for grief. Doctors stopped promising recovery and started offering honesty. Funeral rituals became shorter, not because loss hurt less, but because it happened too often, and above it all, silence. Religious leaders continued speaking, but their words felt recycled, worn thin from repetition. The same assurances, the same explanations, the same hope, delivered with decreasing conviction. People still prayed, but something had changed. The prayers sounded different now, less confident, less certain. More like questions than requests. Children asked things adults couldn't answer. Why didn't God save her? Did we pray wrong? Is God angry? Adults avoided eye contact when those questions were asked, because deep down they were asking the same things. The silence hurt, not because God didn't say yes, but because God didn't say no either. There was no rejection to argue against, no answer to reinterpret. Just emptiness. For the first time, people felt something terrifying, abandonment, not the dramatic kind, not rage or rebellion, but quiet disappointment, the kind that settles into the chest and refuses to leave. People began noticing something they had never noticed before. The world kept moving without divine interruption. Disasters followed physics, disease followed biology, war followed human decisions. Nothing broke its own rules to save anyone. And that realization was more painful than any loss, because if God was silent now, had he always been? People continued their rituals, but many felt hollow performing them. Faith started feeling like habit instead of connection, like speaking into a room where no one was listening. Still, most clung to belief, because letting go felt worse than waiting. But waiting, when unanswered, becomes suffering. Chapter 4. The day faith cracked. It wasn't one tragedy. It was everything happening at once. A moment arrived, not marked by a date, but by awareness, when millions across the world realized they were all asking the same question at the same time. And no answer came. Entire nations prayed simultaneously, different languages, different gods, different rituals, same desperation. Nothing changed. No miracle interrupted the pattern. No divine sign redirected the course of events. Reality continued forward, indifferent to belief. And in that moment, something ancient fractured. Faith did not collapse. It cracked. People felt it internally, a sharp, quiet break in certainty. The realization formed slowly but unmistakably. We might be alone in this. Not spiritually alone, but practically. People still believed in God, but they stopped expecting rescue. The shift was subtle, but irreversible. Hope detached from expectation. Prayer detached from outcome. For the first time, humans understood that belief did not guarantee protection. That day did not create atheists. It created something far more unsettling, believers who no longer felt safe. Faith had always promised intervention. Now it offered only presence. And presence felt insufficient in a world on fire. That was the day faith cracked, not loudly, not publicly, but inside millions of minds at once. And once cracked, it could never return to its original form. Chapter 5, Anger Towards God. Anger did not arrive suddenly. It arrived after hope was exhausted. At first, people were careful with their emotions. Disappointment was allowed. Confusion was understandable, but anger felt forbidden. To be angry at God felt like betrayal, like blasphemy, like crossing an invisible line that humanity had respected for centuries. Yet anger does not ask for permission. It began quietly, in hospital corridors where prayers had failed, in homes where empty chairs replaced living faces, in graveside silences where no explanation could soften the truth. People stopped asking why this happened and started asking why nothing stopped it. The questions changed tone. Why would God allow this? Why create us just to watch us suffer? Why promise protection if there was none? For the first time, these questions were not whispered. They were spoken aloud, written, shared, argued over. Temples that were once full of devotion echoed with frustration. Some people stopped visiting altogether, not because they stopped believing, but because they felt betrayed. Others went more often, not to pray, but to confront. Their prayers turned sharp, desperate, sometimes accusatory. We did everything you asked. We believed. We obeyed. Where were you? Religious leaders struggled. Some tried to calm the anger, calling it a test of faith. Others condemned it, warning of punishment for doubt. But the words no longer carried the same weight. Authority weakened when answers failed. People were no longer afraid of offending God. They were afraid of being abandoned by Him. Faith had once been a source of comfort. Now it felt like a broken promise, and broken promises hurt more than lies. Some people turned their anger inward, blaming themselves. Others turned it outward, rejecting belief entirely. Families split over faith, communities fractured. Arguments that once ended with "God will decide" now ended with silence or resentment. And yet, beneath the anger, there was still longing. People didn't want God to disappear. They wanted Him to explain. But explanations never came. And anger, when unanswered, hardens. Chapter 6. The truth no one wanted. The most painful truths are not discovered, they are accepted. Slowly, painfully, humanity began to confront a possibility it had avoided for thousands of years. Maybe God was never meant to save us, not in the way people had believed, not as a rescuer who interrupts reality, not as a shield against consequence, not as a force that bends the world to human comfort. This idea did not come from rebellion. It came from exhaustion. People began to reflect, not emotionally but honestly. They looked at history, wars, plagues, famines, extinctions. Suffering was not new. Faith had existed alongside it, not in place of it. Maybe belief had never been a guarantee. Maybe it had always been interpretation. God, some began to think, was not absent now. God had never intervened before either. That realization hurt more than anger ever had, because it meant humanity had misunderstood faith itself, had mistaken comfort for protection, had treated belief like insurance against pain. The truth no one wanted was this: faith was not a contract. It did not promise safety. It did not promise fairness. It did not promise survival. It promised meaning. And meaning, people realized too late, does not prevent suffering. It only explains it. Some resisted this truth fiercely. Others accepted it reluctantly. But once the idea formed, it could not be erased. God as a silent observer made more sense than God as a selective savior. That did not make God cruel, it made God different. And that difference changed everything. Humanity had spent centuries asking God to fix what humans broke. Now they saw the flaw in that thinking. Expecting divine correction had allowed human irresponsibility to grow unchecked. Wars were human, greed was human, destruction was human. And waiting for God to undo human actions had been a convenient escape from accountability. The truth was not comforting, but it was honest. Chapter 7. When humans looked at each other. The moment humanity stopped looking upward, it looked around. And what it saw changed everything. There were no divine hands reaching down, but there were human hands reaching out. Doctors working without rest. Volunteers risking their lives for strangers. Ordinary people sharing food, shelter, and safety without expecting reward or salvation. For the first time, survival was not attributed to prayer alone, but to action. People noticed something powerful. When humans acted, things changed. Disease slowed because of effort. Hunger eased because of sharing. Violence reduced because of intervention. No miracles, just responsibility. Heroes were no longer saints or prophets. They were nurses, firefighters, teachers, scientists, neighbors. The hands that saved humanity were not divine. They were human. And that realization was both terrifying and empowering. Terrifying because it meant there was no one else to blame. Empowering because it meant change was possible. Faith didn't disappear in this shift. It transformed. Prayer became reflection. Belief became motivation. God became conscience. People began to understand something profound. If God existed within humanity, then saving the world was a shared duty, not a divine favor. And for the first time in history, humans stopped waiting. Chapter 8. God did not leave. Humans changed with time. Anger softened, not because wounds healed, but because rage requires energy, and humanity was tired. In that quiet exhaustion, a new understanding began to form. It did not arrive through sermons or scriptures. It arrived through reflection, through watching what happened when humans stopped begging and started acting. God had not vanished. God had not turned away. God had not failed to appear. Humans had simply changed the question. Instead of asking, "Why didn't God save us?" they began asking, "Well, what were we supposed to do?" This shift did not come easily. Many resisted it. Accepting that God did not intervene meant accepting that responsibility had always belonged to humanity, that suffering was not divine neglect, but human consequence mixed with natural law. People began revisiting old beliefs with new eyes. Sacred texts once read as promises of protection were reread as lessons in resilience, morality, and unity. Stories once interpreted as miracles were now seen as metaphors for courage, sacrifice, and collective effort. Perhaps God was never meant to be an external rescuer. Perhaps God was meant to be an internal compass. This idea did not reduce God, it reframed him. God was no longer the force that stopped disasters. God was the force that shaped how humans responded to them. In this understanding, faith matured. People stopped asking God to remove pain and began asking for strength to face it. They stopped pleading for miracles and began seeking clarity. Prayer transformed from request into reflection, a moment of alignment rather than expectation. This was not the death of belief, it was its evolution. And for the first time, humanity felt something unexpected, relief. Because if God had never promised rescue, then God had never broken a promise. Chapter 9. The new meaning of faith. Faith, once loud and public, became quiet and personal. People prayed less for outcomes and more for understanding. Rituals became simpler, less performance, less fear, less bargaining. Belief was no longer about being watched, it was about being guided. God was no longer imagined as a distant authority waiting to judge. God was felt as a presence shaping conscience. Right and wrong stopped being enforced by fear of punishment and began to be driven by responsibility. People helped not because heaven demanded it, but because suffering required it. Faith stopped being inherited and started being chosen. Some believed deeply, some believed differently, some let go entirely, and surprisingly, the world did not collapse. Morality did not vanish. Meaning did not disappear. Hope did not die. Instead, it diversified. Faith was no longer a single story repeated across generations. It became millions of internal dialogues, personal, honest, evolving. God was no longer blamed for tragedy, nor credited for survival. God became something quieter, stronger, and harder to define. A reminder, a question, a moral mirror, and in that space humanity stood taller than it ever had before. Chapter 10. The day humans realized God would not save them. There was no single moment, no announcement, no revelation, just a quiet understanding shared across generations. God would not stop wars, God would not cure disease, God would not prevent disaster. Humans would have to do it themselves. This realization did not kill faith, it matured it. God stopped being a rescuer and became an idea, and humanity stepped forward